Hi everybody, welcome back. Had a bit of an extended break. Sometimes it's good just to recharge your batteries. We're going to go through game 2 of the most instructive games ever played by Irving Chernev. Alright, so this game was played by M.Tal. Now whenever you see a game by M.Tal, you see great sacrifices, and he normally wins with an attack on the opponent's king. Now this game is totally different. M.Tal here wins a nice in-game, and basically what he does here is he penetrates into his opponent's position with the king. So it's a very, very good example of using your king as an active piece in the endgame. So let's get started. White played e4, black played c5. This is the start of the Sicilian defense. White played knight f3, d6, d4, the open Sicilian for white. C takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and g6. This is the start of the Sicilian dragon. Now, pretty much all the time now, everybody plays the Yugoslav Attack, which goes bishop e3, f3, queen d2, bishop c4, and castle queenside. Okay. When this game was played, though, the very popular move was f4. This is known as the 11 fish variation for white. And if black just continues with his normal development here, with, for example, bishop g7, white has got some tricks. Okay, so for example, white can play e5. Now when the pawn takes, white recaptures, and now this knight is actually quite uncomfortable. So for example, let's say the knight moves to g4. Now here white's already winning in a big way. Starting with bishop b5 check. If anything blocks onto the square, let's say for example bishop here, we can simply capture the knight. Or if, let's say for example, this knight blocks, we can still capture the knight. If the king moves to f8, we then have the very nice knight e6 check, and it also wins a queen because we've got a discovered attack on the black queen. Black can play bishop g7. It's not completely losing, but it's very tricky. The move which I would recommend, which I also used to play when I used to play the Sicilian dragon, is knight c6. Right, white captures, black recaptures. The idea is to play e5, which white does now. And the move I used to play was knight g8, which is very playable, and also the move that black played in the game, which is knight d7. Okay, pawn takes, and now white's idea is simply going to be play something like this, queen somewhere, and castle queenside. So bishop e3, bishop e7, queen f3, attacking this pawn on c6 and getting ready to castle queenside. So d5, castle queenside, bishop f6, bishop d4. Now this is an instructive moment simply because if we can trade off our dark squared bishop for black's dark squared bishop, we'd probably get a bit of an advantage, because if you can notice, all his pawns, or most of his pawns, are on white squares. So potentially those pawns are going to block his bishop that goes onto white squares. Whereas his bishop on f6 is not restricted by those pawns. So this is his good bishop. That's black's bad bishop. So if we can trade these guys off, he's going to be left with a bad bishop. So, and there's nothing much he can really do to stop us from swapping off his bishop. If he moves the bishop away, we're going to win the rook. Okay. Alright, so black castled, and now white played h4. A lot of you are saying here, well, here white goes. Okay, M.Tal coming with is an attack. Well, it's true, but at the same time it's not quite true. Okay, let's say for example black plays bishop takes pawn. Okay, this would just win for white on the spot. White would start off with queen h3, threatening the bishop second time. His only move to save the bishop, obviously he can't move the bishop away, because if he does, I've got checkmate on h7. So the only move that saves the bishop is g5. Now we can play g3, because the bishop can't move anyway, and even if it could, that would be a problem from the queen's attack on h3. Now black plays knight f6, opening up a discovered attack on our queen, but now we just play f5 and this bishop is trapped and white would just be winning. So after h4, black was wise enough not to take the pawn but to play rook b8. Whenever you castle on opposite sides of the board, the whole idea is to attack your opponent's king on that side. So white is attacking on this side, and the best option for black is to attack on this side. Okay, whoever's attack comes first normally wins the game. So black understands this and plays rook b8. Now black also has a threat here. Let's say for example white does a nothing move, let's say g4, okay, maybe with the idea of playing h5, then black would be winning, because he would play bishop takes bishop, rook takes, and then queen b6, and now black's got a double attack, threatening the rook and threatening this pawn on b2. So after rook b8, white played queen f2, stopping this idea. Obviously if the bishop takes now, the queen can capture, and now when queen b6 we can just simply take the queen off. Alright, so after queen f2, rook b4, hitting this bishop on d4, forcing us to do what we wanted to do, which is swap off the black squared bishop. Knight takes f6. Now notice, now that we've got rid of that black squared bishop, all these pawns, all these squares on dark squares become really, really weak. If you've also been paying attention, you would have noticed that this pawn on a7 has been hanging for like about 2-3 moves maybe, and it would be unwise to take this pawn. Remember, we should be attacking where his king is, not opening up lines where he's attacking us. Okay, so white never takes that pawn on a7 while the queen's on the board. White played a3, queen b6. Okay, obviously we can't take the rook because then he'll take our queen. So white played queen takes queen, rook takes b6, and now knight a4. Normally moving your knight to the edge of the board is a bad idea. However, we're trying to stop these pawns from moving forward. They could become dangerous if they move forward. And the way to stop that is to block the squares in front of the pawn, which happen to be weak because we swapped off the dark squared bishops. So rook b8, bishop d3, just finishing developing, knight h5, threatening our pawn, rook to f1, defending, rook e7, and now white plays a very, very interesting move. He plays the move f5. Now, what do you guys think about this move? I'm going to give you guys a second or two to think about it and come up with a conclusion about what do you think about this move. Alright, so f5, the idea behind f5 is it's a positional sacrifice. Alright, white wants to weaken black's king by getting him to capture here And also, when that pawn captures, this bishop is pretty much dead. All his pawns are going to block in that bishop. Now, even though we'll be a pawn down, he'll pretty much be playing without a bishop for a couple of moves. And black doesn't really have much of a choice. So he captures. Rook e1. Now we go off this file. There's no reason to keep the rook here. It's no longer defending the pawn. It's to stop black from getting both his rooks on this file, which would be very good for him. So rook there. Rook takes. Rook takes. And now the king starts his march up the board on these dark squares. Okay, so he starts off with that move, then you'll go here, you go there, maybe even here, maybe even there, maybe even there. Can you even imagine that that king's going to do that walk now? Let's have a look. King d7, knight g3, trying to bring his rook, his knight back into the game. King c3, f4. Okay, now f4, the idea is to try and get his bishop back into the game. Maybe he wants to go there, maybe he wants to go there. So this move had to be played. So after f4, king d4. Notice the activity of this king compared to black's king. Bishop f5, rook d2, rook e6. Now black's idea is simply to move his rook to h6 and then capture this pawn on h4, which is quite weak. Knight c5, bringing our knight into the game. Notice how we are blocking these pawns on the dark squares. He's got no control over the dark squares. Rook h6, king e5. Now we're hitting the bishop and we're hitting the pawn. So he trades off, bishop takes, bishop takes. Now normally the rule is when you down material or pieces, you do not want to trade off pieces. Now here, if we count, we see white's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns, and black's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns, and we're about to lose another pawn. So why is white trading off? Well, he's trading off here because even though he's down material, because of his king activity, he's actually better in this endgame. So rook takes pawn, king d6. Notice how this king's going. Rook h6, check, king c7. Knight f5, bringing his knight close into the game. King b7. Knight d4. Rook f2, hitting the pawn on f4. a5, rook takes pawn, knight e6. Now, in this position, black played king f8. Let's say, for example, black tries to swap off pieces. Remember, you have material, you should swap off pieces, right? Because he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns against our 4 pawns. But this is a very good example of how bad his position actually is. So let's say, for example, we capture. He recaptures. We capture the knight. He captures. So black should be winning, right? Definitely not. Because now the king captures on c6. We even material. He brings his king a bit closer, and immediately we play b4. And this pawn is going to go through and become a queen. The activity of this king is phenomenal, and it wins the game. So black tried king f8 instead of blocking with the rook. King takes c6, knight takes c5, check from the rook. There was no other discovered attack black could try that would win the game. There's no way he can attack this rook, unfortunately. So knight takes, king takes, rook e6, king takes d5. Already we're a pawn up. Rook b6, hitting this pawn on b2, b4, pawn takes, king e7, king c5, threatening the black rook, rook f6. And now a very interesting thing. Okay, what we need to do to get this pawn through is to actually block this king from coming over to the queen side. So white plays rook d4, rook f5 check, king b6, sorry, rook f6 check, king c7. Now black can't keep checking our king, so we can maybe start advancing the pawn, rook f5, stopping the advance of the pawn. So what do we do? Rook e4, moving this king further back. Okay, if you guys notice, when the kings are opposite each other and the rook checks, the king has to move black. This is a common pattern in the checkmate with the king and the rook. So the king moves back, pushing him further away from the queen side. King c6. Again, the rook can't check our king. Rook f2, threatening this pawn and maybe ideas of checking behind. We defend the pawn. h5. Now when I first saw this move, I thought this was really bad. But it's actually a very clever idea in the endgame. White's still winning, but the whole idea is to give away this pawn to create a very dangerous passed f-pawn. White captures, king g5, b5, f5, threatening our rook. Now whenever you got a passed pawn in a rook endgame, you want the rook behind the passed pawn, because then it can help it push up the board. So rook b4, f4, b6, f3, b7, rook c2 check, king d5, f2, and queen. Now actually in this position already, black resigned, so the game could have continued. Rook c2, king d5, f2, b8 queen, f8 queen, and now because we start checking first, we win this game very easily. King g3, king f6, queen g6 check, king e7, and rook b7. And it's going to be a mate in 3 moves maximum. For example, you'd have to block like that. Rook takes, king f8, and we've got check there and mate. So very interesting game on how to use your king in the endgame. Notice those weak dark squares of blacks once the bishops were traded off. And I hope you guys enjoyed this game. Remember, this is game 2 of 62 games from the Most Instructive Games by Irving Chernev. This was M.Tal, one of the greatest world champions that ever lived, and obviously he knows how to play the endgame. Thanks guys, see you guys for the next one.